There is a photograph that almost no one remembers, but everyone should see. It was taken in 1900 in the Forbidden City in Beijing. 8 foreign soldiers stand in a line, representing 8 different nations: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the United States. They are posing in front of the throne of the Chinese emperor. Their boots are dirty. Their rifles rest casually against priceless artifacts. They are smiling. Behind them, just barely visible in the frame, is a Chinese man in imperial robes. He is not sitting on the throne. He is standing to the side, almost out of frame, like a servant in his own palace. This photograph was taken after the 8-nation alliance invaded China to crush the Boxer Rebellion. These soldiers had just marched into the heart of Chinese civilization, looted the summer palaces, and dictated terms to a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. The message of the photograph is unmistakable. We are in charge now. You are not. What makes this photograph so important is not what it shows, but what it represents. It represents the emotional reality of the last 200 years. It represents a world order built not just on military power or economic strength, but on a hierarchy of civilization. A hierarchy in which white European nations stood at the top and everyone else stood below. That order, built on colonialism, gunboat diplomacy, and the unshakable belief in Western superiority, became the invisible operating system of the modern world. And now, for the first time since that photograph was taken, a non-white, non-Western power is rising to challenge it. Not as a supplicant, not as a junior partner, but as an equal, perhaps even as a superior. This is not just a geopolitical shift. It is a psychological earthquake. And if you want to understand why the reaction to China in Washington, in Brussels, in London is so visceral, so emotional, so laced with language that borders on hysteria, you have to understand what is actually being threatened. It is not just American hegemony. It is the myth of white civilization as the eternal vanguard of human progress. Let me be clear about something before we go further. This is not a story about good guys and bad guys. This is not a defense of the Chinese Communist Party. This is not an attack on the West. This is an attempt to excavate a truth that lies buried beneath the surface of every China debate, every think tank report, every congressional hearing. That truth is this: race matters. Culture matters. And the West is terrified not because China is authoritarian, but because China is other. If you doubt this, ask yourself a simple question. Why did the rise of Japan in the 1980s provoke such a hysterical reaction in the United States, even though Japan was a democracy, a military ally, and posed zero security threat? Japanese investors bought Rockefeller Center in New York. They bought Pebble Beach. They bought Hollywood studios. And the American reaction was not economic analysis. It was panic. Books were published with titles like The Coming War with Japan. Congressmen smashed Toshiba radios on the steps of the Capitol. Automotive workers took sledgehammers to Japanese cars in public demonstrations. This was not rational. Japan was not colonizing America. It was buying real estate. But the reaction was primal because what Japan represented was unacceptable. It represented the idea that an Asian nation could outcompete the West on its own terms, in its own industries, using its own model. And if Japan, a small island nation with no natural resources, could do this, what did that say about the myth of Western superiority? The panic subsided only when Japan's economy collapsed in the 1990s. The natural order, it seemed, had been restored. But China is not Japan. China will not collapse on cue. And this time, the challenge is existential. Because China is not just competing in manufacturing or finance. It is offering an entirely different vision of how a society can organize itself, govern itself, and succeed. And that vision, maddeningly for the West, is working. Now, let me take you back further. Let me take you to the origin of the fear. It begins not with economics or ideology, but with a nightmare that has haunted the European imagination for 800 years. In the year 1241, a Mongol army appeared at the gates of Europe. They had swept across Asia, destroying everything in their path. They burned cities, they slaughtered armies, they moved with a speed and ferocity that seemed inhuman. European knights, the finest warriors in Christendom, rode out to meet them. At the Battle of Legnica, in what is now Poland, the Mongols annihilated them. They used tactics the Europeans had never seen: feigned retreats, composite bows, psychological warfare. After the battle, the Mongols piled the severed ears of the dead into sacks. 9 sacks. Historians estimate this meant tens of thousands of dead. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the Mongols withdrew. Not because they were defeated, but because their great Khan had died, and the generals had to return to Mongolia to elect a successor. Europe had been spared by accident, but the terror remained. The Mongols were not like other invaders. They were not fellow Europeans squabbling over borders. They were alien. They had yellow skin, slanted eyes, and a language no one could understand. They ate different food. They prayed to different gods. And they had nearly conquered Europe. This trauma embedded itself in the Western psyche. It became a myth, a story told and retold in different forms. The Yellow Horde, the barbarian invasion from the East, the idea that one day a vast, incomprehensible, disciplined mass of Asiatic peoples would rise up and overwhelm the civilized West. This is the origin of the term yellow peril, and it has never gone away. It simply mutates. In the 19th century, when Chinese laborers were brought to America to build the railroads, they were described in newspapers as a yellow tide that would swamp white civilization. Cartoons depicted them as rats, as locusts, as subhuman creatures spreading disease. Laws were passed, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, to keep them out. Not because they were lazy, but because they worked too hard. They undercut white wages. They threatened white economic dominance. The fear was not of inferiority. It was of equality. In the 20th century, the yellow peril reappeared in popular culture. In the novels of Sax Rohmer, the villain Fu Manchu was the embodiment of this fear. He was brilliant, cruel, and utterly alien. He was plotting the downfall of the white race from his lair in London's Chinatown. These were not fringe fantasies. They were bestsellers, read by millions, adapted into films, absorbed into the cultural bloodstream. I know this because I absorbed them myself. I grew up in Singapore, a former British colony. As a boy, I read the Fu Manchu novels. I found them thrilling. And somewhere deep in my mind, without realizing it, I began to believe the message they contained. That evil, real civilizational evil had a yellow face. That the Chinese, my own people, were the villains of history. It took me years to unlearn this, to realize that I had internalized a racist myth created by my colonizers, and if I, a non-Westerner, could be conditioned to fear and despise my own kind, imagine how deeply this fear runs in the minds of those who created the myth. This is the unspoken subtext of every China debate. When American officials talk about the China threat, they are not just talking about missiles and tariffs. They are tapping into a reservoir of civilizational anxiety that goes back centuries, and the evidence of this is everywhere, if you know where to look. In 2019, Kiron Skinner, the director of policy planning at the U.S. State Department, gave a public talk. This is one of the most important jobs in American foreign policy. It was once held by George Kennan, the architect of Cold War containment. And Skinner said something that was supposed to stay inside the room. She said that the competition with China was different from the Cold War with the Soviet Union because, and I quote, "It's the first time that we will have a great power competitor that is not Caucasian." She said this out loud. In 2019, in Washington, there was criticism, yes, but what is more revealing is that she was merely saying out loud what many in the foreign policy establishment think in private. The Soviet Union was terrifying. But it was a family quarrel. Karl Marx was German. Lenin and Stalin were Europeans. They spoke a European language, followed a European ideology, and governed a largely white population. They were, in a strange way, comprehensible. Cousins who had gone astray, but cousins nonetheless. China is not a cousin. China is the other. And for 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution gave the West an overwhelming technological and military advantage, the other has been kept in its place. Colonized, subjugated, lectured, controlled. The West has ruled the world for so long that it has come to believe this is the natural order, that white, liberal, democratic civilization represents the endpoint of human development, that all other societies are merely developing, moving along a path toward becoming more like the West. This belief is so deeply embedded that it is rarely questioned. It is simply assumed. And now China is shattering that assumption, not by rejecting modernity, but by achieving it on its own terms. China has not become a liberal democracy. It has not adopted Western values. And yet it has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It has built the world's most advanced infrastructure. It is leading in electric vehicles, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. It is doing all of this while remaining unmistakably Chinese. And this, more than anything else, is what the West cannot accept. Because if China succeeds, it proves that there is more than one path to modernity. It proves that you do not need to be Western to be modern. It proves that the liberal democratic model is not universal, but particular. And if that is true, then the entire moral justification for 2 centuries of Western dominance collapses. The West told itself a story. We are successful because we are free, because we are democratic, because we respect human rights, because we are, in short, virtuous. But if China can succeed without these things, then maybe the West's success had nothing to do with virtue. Maybe it had to do with power, with colonialism, with the exploitation of resources and labor from the rest of the world, with a temporary technological advantage that is now fading. This is the unspoken fear. Not that China will invade, not that China will impose communism on the world, but that China's success will expose the West's story about itself as a lie. And so the reaction is not rational, it is emotional, it is existential. It is the reaction of a civilization that believed it was the protagonist of history, suddenly realizing it might just be one character among many. You can see this in the language. China is not described as a competitor, it is described as a threat, an enemy, a challenge to the rules-based international order. But whose rules? Whose order? The international order was built by the West, for the West. It was built at a time when the West had all the guns, all the money, and all the power. And now China is strong enough to ask, why should we follow rules we had no part in writing? This question is treated as aggression. But is it? Or is it simply the question of a civilization that remembers what happened the last time it was weak? Let me tell you what happened. In 1839, the British Empire went to war with China, not because China attacked Britain, but because China refused to buy British opium. The British were smuggling opium into China, addicting millions, and draining China's silver reserves. When the Chinese emperor tried to stop this by confiscating and destroying the opium, the British sent gunboats. They bombarded Chinese ports. They forced China to sign a treaty that ceded Hong Kong, opened 5 ports to foreign trade, and gave British citizens extraterritorial rights. This means that British citizens in China were not subject to Chinese law. They could commit crimes and be tried only by British courts. This was not diplomacy. This was humiliation. And it was just the beginning. Over the next century, China was carved up by foreign powers: the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Japanese. They established spheres of influence. They extracted concessions. They ruled Chinese territory as if it were their own. In 1860, British and French troops marched into Beijing. They looted the old Summer Palace, one of the most magnificent architectural wonders in the world. They took what they wanted: jade, silk, gold, ancient manuscripts, and then they burned it to the ground. The fire burned for 3 days. The smoke was so thick it turned the sky black over Beijing. This is not ancient history to the Chinese. This is living memory. Every Chinese schoolchild learns about the century of humiliation. They learn that when China was weak, the civilized West did not offer partnership. It offered conquest. And so, when Western leaders today lecture China about human rights, about freedom, about the rules-based order, the Chinese hear something else. They hear hypocrisy. They hear the voice of the colonizer, dressed in new language, trying to keep China in its place. This does not mean China is right. It does not mean the Chinese government's actions are justified. But it means that if you want to understand why China behaves the way it does, you cannot ignore this history. You cannot ignore the fact that the so-called rules-based international order was built on the ruins of Chinese sovereignty. And you cannot ignore the fact that race and civilization are part of this story, whether we want to admit it or not. Now let me bring this back to the present, because the psychological barrier I am describing is not just historical, it is active. It is shaping policy right now. Look at how differently the West treats China compared to other rising powers. India is also rising. India is a large, populous nation with nuclear weapons and growing economic strength. But there is no India threat narrative. There is no talk of containing India, of decoupling from India, of India as an existential enemy. Why? Because India is a democracy, and because India never sent hordes to threaten Europe. The yellow peril myth is specific. It does not apply to brown people, only to East Asians. Look at how the West reacted to COVID. When the virus emerged in Wuhan, the immediate reaction in much of the Western media was not scientific curiosity. It was suspicion. It was the lab leak theory, presented not as a hypothesis to investigate, but as an accusation. It was the language of the diseased East, the dirty other, the yellow peril spreading contagion. And when China managed to control the virus through strict lockdowns, while the West suffered catastrophic death tolls, there was no reflection. There was no admission that perhaps, just perhaps, an authoritarian state could respond more effectively to a pandemic than a fractured democracy. Instead, the narrative shifted. The lockdowns were described as brutal, inhumane, violations of freedom. And when China finally reopened and cases surged, the Western media said, "See, they failed after all." The double standard is glaring. When the West fails, it is because of bad luck, complexity, or understandable mistakes. When China fails, it is because the system is rotten. And when China succeeds, it is either dismissed, ignored, or attributed to cheating. China's technological advances are never described as innovation. They are described as theft. As if the only way a non-Western nation could possibly achieve such things is by stealing from the West. This is the voice of civilizational arrogance. And it is poison. It blinds the West to reality. It prevents Western policymakers from seeing China clearly. They cannot see China's genuine strengths because they are too busy looking for weaknesses. They cannot learn from China's successes because they are too proud to admit that a non-Western system might have something to teach them. And so, they make strategic blunder after strategic blunder. They underestimate China. They assume that because the Chinese Communist Party is authoritarian, it must be fragile. They assume that the Chinese people are yearning to be free, yearning to overthrow their government, yearning to become like Americans. But the Chinese people are not yearning for that. They are looking at the chaos in the United States, the political polarization, the gun violence, the crumbling infrastructure, the inability to respond to a pandemic. And they are thinking, we do not want that. We want stability. We want prosperity. We want our children to have better lives than we did. And our system, for all its flaws, is delivering that. This does not mean they love the Communist Party. It means they are pragmatic. And the West's inability to understand this pragmatism, its insistence on projecting its own values onto a civilization that does not share them, is leading to catastrophic miscalculation. The West is preparing for a clash of civilizations. But the clash is not between democracy and authoritarianism. It is between a civilization that believes it is universal and a civilization that knows it is not. Let me end this first part with a question. If China succeeds, if it becomes the world's largest economy, if it remains governed by the Communist Party, if it offers an alternative model of development to the global South, what will that mean for the West's understanding of itself? Will the West be able to accept that its way is not the only way? Or will it cling to the myth of superiority even as the world moves on? This is the real question. And the answer will determine whether the 21st century is an era of coexistence or an era of conflict. The unspoken fear is not about missiles. It is about meaning. It is about whether the West can accept a world in which it is no longer the center, no longer the model, no longer the civilization that all others aspire to join. That is the fear. And until we name it, we cannot overcome it. Now I want to take you inside the room where the fear becomes policy. I want to show you how the psychological barrier we have been discussing translates into concrete decisions that shape the world. Because it is one thing to acknowledge that subconscious bias exists. It is another thing entirely to see how it operates at the highest levels of power, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the boardrooms of multinational corporations, and in the editorial meetings of the world's most influential newspapers. Let me start with a conversation I had several years ago with a senior American diplomat. We were at a private dinner, off the record, the kind of setting where people say what they really think. He had spent decades working on Asia policy. He was intelligent, well-traveled, fluent in Mandarin, not the kind of person you would expect to harbor crude prejudices. And yet, after a few glasses of wine, he said something that stayed with me. He said, "The problem with China is that they don't think like us. They don't value the same things. They're fundamentally alien. And I don't know if we can ever really trust them." I asked him what he meant. He struggled to articulate it. He talked about opacity, about lack of transparency, about the difficulty of reading Chinese intentions. But the more he talked, the clearer it became. What he was really saying was, they are not like us, and because they are not like us, they must be a threat. This is the logic that underpins American China policy. It is not based on a clear-eyed assessment of Chinese actions. It is based on a deep, unexamined assumption that difference equals danger, and this assumption is leading the United States into a trap. The trap is this. The United States is treating China as if it were the Soviet Union. It is dusting off the Cold War playbook, the playbook of containment, of ideological competition, of building alliances to encircle the enemy. But China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a revolutionary power. It believed in exporting communism to the world. It funded insurgencies, backed coups, and tried to spread its ideology by force. The Soviet Union wanted to make you Soviet. China does not want to make you Chinese. Let me repeat that because it is crucial. China does not want to make you Chinese. The Chinese Communist Party is not an evangelical organization. It does not believe that its model is replicable. It does not believe that Marxism-Leninism, with Chinese characteristics, can be transplanted to Kenya or Brazil or anywhere else. It believes that the Chinese model works for China because China is China. 5,000 years of continuous civilization, a Confucian cultural substrate, a particular historical experience. The idea that this can be exported is absurd to them. And yet, Western policymakers continue to project Western missionary impulses onto China. They assume that because the West has spent centuries trying to convert the world to Christianity, to democracy, to capitalism, that China must have similar ambitions. They assume that China wants to create a new world order in its own image. But what China actually wants is much simpler and in some ways more challenging. China wants respect. It wants to be treated as an equal. It wants a seat at the table where the rules are written, not just a chair in the corner where it is expected to follow rules written by others. And it wants the rest of the world to stop telling it how to govern itself. This is not world domination. This is status recognition. But to the West, this is unacceptable, because the West built the current international order, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. These institutions were designed when the West had overwhelming power. They reflect Western values, Western interests, and Western assumptions about how the world should work. And now China is saying, we are strong enough to demand changes. We want more voting power in the IMF. We want our currency to be part of the global reserve system. We want our development model, our infrastructure projects, our vision of connectivity to be taken seriously. To Western ears, this sounds like revisionism, like an attempt to overturn the order. But from a Chinese perspective, it is simply asking for fairness, asking that the rules reflect the reality of the 21st century, not the reality of 1945. The tragedy is that the West cannot hear this. It cannot hear it because to hear it would require admitting that the current order is not neutral, not universal, not based purely on high-minded principles. It would require admitting that the order is a reflection of power, and that when power shifts, the order must shift too. Instead, the West is doubling down. It is trying to freeze the current order in place. It is forming new alliances, AUKUS, the Quad, trying to build a coalition to contain China. It is restricting Chinese access to technology, banning Huawei, blocking semiconductor exports, treating economic interdependence not as a source of stability, but as a vulnerability to be eliminated. This is the language of confrontation. And it is driven not by a rational calculation of interest, but by fear. Fear that if China is allowed to rise, the West will fall. fear that the world can only have one leader, one model, one civilization at the top. But this is a false binary. The world is not a zero-sum game. China's rise does not require America's fall. There is room for two superpowers. There is room for multiple models of governance, multiple paths to development, multiple centers of innovation and influence. The question is whether the West can accept this, whether it can let go of the idea that it must always be number one, whether it can make the world, as John F. Kennedy once said, safe for diversity. Let me tell you about a moment in history that offers a different path. In 1972, Richard Nixon went to China. This was at the height of the Cold War. China and the United States had been enemies for more than 20 years. They had fought each other in Korea. They had nearly gone to war over Taiwan. The ideological gulf was vast. And yet Nixon and Mao Zedong found a way to talk. Not because they trusted each other, not because they liked each other, but because they both understood that the alternative, continued hostility, was worse. They understood that two great powers could coexist, even if they disagreed on almost everything. They could manage their competition. They could find areas of cooperation. They could prevent the competition from spiraling into war. That understanding held for nearly 50 years. It created the conditions for China's integration into the global economy. It created the conditions for the greatest reduction in poverty in human history. It created the conditions for a period of relative peace and prosperity, despite deep ideological differences. But now, that understanding is breaking down. And it is breaking down not because of a single event, not because China invaded a neighbor or launched a nuclear weapon. It is breaking down because the psychological foundation has shifted. The West no longer sees China as a developing country that needs to be integrated. It sees China as a peer competitor. And for the first time in 2 centuries, that peer competitor is not white. This changes everything, because it activates fears that run deeper than geopolitics. It activates the fear of displacement, of obsolescence, of losing not just power, but identity. Let me make this concrete. In the American imagination, the story of the 20th century is a story of American triumph. The United States defeated fascism. It defeated communism. It spread democracy and prosperity around the world. It was, in the words of politicians from both parties, the indispensable nation. This story is not just propaganda. It is deeply believed. It is part of American identity. And now China is disrupting that story. China is showing that you can prosper without American-style democracy, that you can innovate without American-style freedom, that you can build a modern society without adopting American values. And this is intolerable, not because it threatens American security, but because it threatens American identity. If America is not the indispensable nation, if its model is not universal, then what is America? This is the crisis. It is not a crisis of power. It is a crisis of meaning. And the response to this crisis is not strategic. It is emotional. It is lashing out. It is tariffs and sanctions and boycotts and rhetoric about defending the free world. But here is what the West is missing. The rest of the world is watching. And they are not buying the narrative. The 88% of humanity that lives outside the West, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, they are looking at this confrontation and seeing something very different from what Washington sees. They see a declining power trying to hold on to dominance. They see a rich country lecturing poor countries about democracy while doing business with dictators when it suits them. They see a civilization that talks about human rights, but has the highest incarceration rate in the world, that talks about freedom, but separates children from their parents at the border. That talks about the rule of law, but launched a war in Iraq based on lies. They see hypocrisy, and they remember history. They remember that when the West was strong, it colonized them. It extracted their resources. It drew arbitrary borders. It installed puppet governments. It overthrew leaders who did not serve Western interests. And now, the West is warning them about Chinese imperialism. But when they look at China, they see something different. They see a country that is offering infrastructure. Roads, railways, ports, power plants. They see a country that is offering investment without political conditions. They see a country that is not lecturing them about how to govern themselves. China is not a saint. Chinese projects come with debt. Chinese labor practices are often exploitative. Chinese companies are there to make money, not to spread goodwill. But compared to the alternative, compared to the International Monetary Fund's structural adjustment programs, compared to Western aid that comes with long lists of demands, compared to military interventions and regime change wars, China looks pretty good. This is why the Belt and Road Initiative has attracted so many countries. Not because they love China, but because they want development. And China is offering it. The West's response has been to criticize, to call it debt trap diplomacy, to warn countries that they are selling their sovereignty. But the West is not offering an alternative. It is not offering better infrastructure projects, better financing terms, better partnerships. It is simply offering warnings. And warnings do not build roads. This is the strategic blindness I am talking about. The West is so focused on containing China that it has forgotten how to compete with China. It has forgotten that the way to win is not to tear down your competitor, but to offer something better. Let me give you an example. Africa is the fastest-growing continent in the world. It has the youngest population. It will soon have the largest workforce. It is the future. And China has been investing in Africa for 2 decades, building infrastructure, training workers, establishing trade relationships. The United States, meanwhile, has largely ignored Africa. American investment in Africa is a fraction of Chinese investment. American engagement with African leaders is sporadic and often condescending. And then American officials go to Africa and tell them not to do business with China. The African response is polite but clear. If you want us to work with you instead of China, show us what you are offering. And so far, the United States has no good answer. This is what happens when policy is driven by fear rather than strategy. Fear makes you reactive. It makes you focus on what you are against, rather than what you're for, and it makes you blind to your own weaknesses. The United States is losing influence in the developing world not because of Chinese propaganda. It is losing influence because it is not delivering. It is not offering a vision of the future that is compelling. It is offering only a defense of the past. And this brings me to the deepest irony of all. The rise of China is not actually a rejection of the West. It is the ultimate validation of the West. Think about it. How did China rise? By adopting Western ideas. China adopted Western science. It adopted Western technology. It adopted Western economics, with Chinese modifications. It adopted the Western concept of the nation-state, the idea that political legitimacy comes from delivering prosperity and security to your people. China looked at the West and said, "You have discovered something powerful. We will learn from you. We will take what works and adapt it to our circumstances." This is not civilizational clash. This is civilizational learning. The Chinese were humble enough to learn from their former oppressors. They did not let pride or resentment stop them from adopting the tools that would make them strong. And now they are strong. And the West's response is not to celebrate this, not to say, look, our ideas worked. We helped lift 1 billion people out of poverty. We helped create a more prosperous world. The West's response is fear. Fear that if China becomes powerful, it will do to the West what the West did to China. Fear that there can only be one dominant civilization, and that if China rises, the West must fall. But this is projection. It is projecting Western history, Western behavior, Western imperialism onto China. It is assuming that China will act the way the West acted when it was powerful. But China is not the West. China does not have a history of sailing around the world, conquering distant lands, and establishing colonies. China has a history of building walls to keep invaders out, not sending armies to invade others. China's historical sphere of influence was regional, not global. It had a tributary system in which neighboring states paid symbolic tribute in exchange for trade and protection. But it did not colonize them. It did not impose Chinese language, Chinese religion, or Chinese governance on them. This does not mean China is peaceful. It does not mean China will not use force to protect what it sees as its interests, especially in Taiwan. But it does mean that the fear that China wants to conquer the world is historically unfounded. It is a fear based not on what China has done, but on what the West has done. And yet, this fear is shaping policy. It is leading to an arms race. It is leading to the militarization of the Indo-Pacific. It is leading to a situation where a miscalculation, a collision of ships, a misunderstood signal could spiral into conflict. And if that conflict comes, it will not be because it was inevitable. It will be because we made it inevitable. Because we told ourselves a story about an enemy and then acted in ways that turned that story into reality. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy, and it is the greatest danger we face. So what is the alternative? How do we escape the trap? The first step is honesty. We must acknowledge that race and civilization are part of this story. We must stop pretending that the fear of China is purely rational, purely about security, purely about values. We must admit that there is a psychological barrier, a deep-seated discomfort with the idea of a non-white superpower. Only by naming this can we begin to dismantle it. The second step is humility. The West must accept that its era of dominance was an aberration. For most of human history, China and India were the largest economies in the world. The West's rise to dominance in the 19th and 20th centuries was made possible by technological advantages that are now spreading, by colonial extraction that is no longer possible, and by a set of circumstances that will not repeat. We are now returning to the historical norm. A world in which multiple civilizations coexist, in which power is distributed, in which no single nation or bloc dominates. This is not a tragedy, it is reality. And the sooner the West accepts it, the sooner we can build a stable framework for managing this new world. The third step is imagination. We must imagine a world in which two very different systems coexist. A world in which American democracy and Chinese meritocracy both exist, both compete, both learn from each other. A world in which the West's emphasis on individual rights and China's emphasis on collective stability are not seen as mortal enemies, but as different approaches to the same challenge: how to build a good society. This requires giving up the missionary impulse, giving up the idea that there is only one right way to organize a society, giving up the need to convert the world. And the fourth step is engagement. Not the naive engagement of the past, where the West assumed that trade would automatically lead to political liberalization, but a hard-headed engagement that recognizes that we have to live on the same planet. that we have shared challenges, climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, that cannot be solved by one country alone. That we have an interest in stability, even if we disagree on almost everything else. John F. Kennedy understood this. In his speech at American University in 1963, in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he said something that feels almost impossible to imagine an American president saying today. He said, "If we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity." Safe for diversity. Not safe for democracy. Not safe for American values. Safe for diversity. This is the wisdom we need now. The wisdom to accept that the world is big enough for more than one model. That China's success does not require America's failure.